Under the Volcano, 1995. The jungle seemed to grow more thick and lush, and we gradually seemed to be going downhill. The sun hung lower in the sky, and we both grew hungry and decided to stop in the next little town to eat. We slowed as we passed through a small village of about a dozen or more houses, and saw what looked like a restaurant with no cars in front of it. It looked closed as we passed, but we were hungry, so we pulled around a U-turn and pulled into the parking lot. Directly across the street was a small building that served as a slaughterhouse. The stone building had no doors or windows. It was open to the elements, and the amount of blood and evidence was incredible. Freshly slaughtered animals hung on hooks from the walls and the ceiling, and the walls and the floors were covered in blood. Impossibly, several men were visible through the doorway, sitting on the floor in the middle of this carnage and gore, with their backs to the wall, resting after their labors. We both stared in amazement with our mouths hung open, and the men began to laugh at us in a manner that was less than friendly. The interior of the restaurant was very dark and empty, and the owner was eager to serve us, but after a few moments the atmosphere of the town unsettled both of us. I didn't say anything, but everything felt wrong here. The restaurant was way too dark, and there was something in the air. It wasn't just the slaughterhouse. And when Hercules asked if we should go, I didn't hesitate. We piled into the Chevy Suburban and looked across the street again at the macabre scene. The men still sat in blood, covered in the room beneath the carcasses, laughing at us, an unspoken threat. Hercules was even more shaken up than I was. It had been a strange day, and the sun was fading fast as we accelerated and headed downhill. Night came quickly in the jungle, and it seemed to close in on us like it hadn't before. The road had changed drastically into a tight curve that hugged the mountainside as we descended toward the Pacific coast. The sensation was like descending into a well or a bottomless pit. I looked out over the jungle before me, and the moon seemed to hang straight ahead at me at eye level. It hung suspended over the jungle, immense and pale. I felt like I was descending into something beyond my control. Somehow, if I didn't turn back now, I knew that I would never escape. But I'm not giving in to superstition, but the sense of terrible destiny came over me, and I began wondering absently if I should get out of the truck and start hitchhiking back to the United States. Here in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, in the jungle. The German General Bismarck said, "Preventative war is like committing suicide for fear of death. You fear your nation, your army is about to be attacked and destroyed by your enemy. So you launch a surprise attack instead, and you are then destroyed anyway. Suicide for fear of death." In Houston, I lived in a combat zone. About 5 blocks east was a famous landmark, Memorial Park. There are next to no zoning laws in Houston to speak of, so gun stores are next to churches, and millionaires live next to paupers. The street that runs past Memorial Park is an invisible dividing line between million-dollar homes near the River Oaks neighborhood and the beginning of the violent barrio that I and my Central American neighbors lived in, known as the Heights. The Houston Heights. The month before I had left, an Irishman was visiting the city, traveling in a cab down that very street, down the invisible line between wealth and war. It was after 2 a.m. in the morning. The bars had just closed, and the cab was taking the Irishman and a friend safely back home after their many libations. They were drunk as lords and happy. Suddenly the banter between the two men ceased, and the interior of the cab became still and foreboding. The Irishman felt a chill. A slow terror crept over him. He suddenly realized he was in mortal danger. No, not mortal danger. He instinctively knew, as sure as the day he was born, that he was about to die. Like all Irishmen, he was somewhat superstitious and clairvoyant. He decided to seek help. He would thwart his inescapable fate. He screamed at the cab driver until he forced him to stop, and he leaped out of the cab and made his way to the nearest house to call for help. The first home he came to had a locked door, and no one answered. He rushed around to the back and began to pound on the French doors in panic, and cry out, and work the handles to try to get inside. He continued to shout for help and try to get inside to escape his dread, to escape his inevitable fate. It was then that the owner fired 2 shots through the back door at what he took to be an intruder trying to break into his home at 2 o'clock in the morning. The Irishman fell backwards silently and was dead in a few moments. Was it his premonition, or was it his fear that had killed him? Some questions have no answers. Suicide for fear of death. Part of the art of staying alive is knowing where you are at. No one told the Irishman that he was on the edge of the most violent neighborhood in town, trying to force his way into a home of a millionaire's row. I instinctively never seriously felt like getting out of the truck in the middle of the jungle, but the more I thought about it, the more easily I discarded the idea. I was in for something big, but getting out of the truck wasn't going to help anything. Sometimes fate is simply unavoidable. Mine was waiting for me somewhere down there below in the midnight jungle. About half an hour went by, but it seemed as if it was almost immediately that a strange feeling had come over me. That then I saw something that transfixed me. For several long miles, I saw a sight that seemed to be an apparition from the poet Homer. A beautiful woman. Then a mile farther, another one. And then a little farther on, another one. All standing alone on the right side of the road, at the edge of the jungle, in the dark, lit only by coal braziers burning at their feet. The women all beckoned to me by raising their right arm from their side to shoulder height, with their palm open, hand facing down. They were beckoning for us to stop and to take our comfort with them by the side of the road. Their long dark hair hung luxuriantly down, and they would pull it over their right shoulder and let it hang down past their waist. I could not believe my eyes and looked over at my companion, but he seemed unmoved, or perhaps even blind. "Don't you see that? Let's stop. Come on, please. What's the matter with you?" I was practically begging now. "Many people stop and are never heard from again. She has friends waiting for you in the dark." I was willing to take my chances, but Hercules was implacable. The death squads, the slaughterhouse, the feeling that I had somehow had some awful destiny before me. Now this, the sirens of the jungle. It put me in a poor mood, to say the least. The sight of the sirens of the jungle made such an impression on me that even today, 20 years later, I can still close my eyes and see them beckon to me. The glow of the coal-fired braziers at their feet, their long hair cascading over their shoulders, and that singular gesture, waving by raising their arm from their side to the shoulder height with palm down. Me straining at the bit to meet them and to meet whatever fate had in store for me. On the rocks below, I held my tongue, but since Hercules would not stop under any circumstances, I didn't want to provoke him. The day had seemed to improve his disposition somewhat, while it had made me feel down and out. But to make things worse now, the logging trucks were traveling up the mountain past us on the tight curves. Though we had the inside track next to the mountain, there was no shoulder to give way, just a sheer side wall of soil and rocks. The logging trucks were driven by bored men who traveled the same route every day and night, every day. 12 hours a day, and apparently needed some relief from this boredom, so they played a little game. The name of the game was Whoosh, to see how close you could come to the car traveling the opposite way without actually hitting it. We had been driving for 3 days without sleep, and now we found ourselves in a game of chicken with fully loaded logging trucks barreling up the narrow mountain road at breakneck speeds, well over 70 miles per hour. There was no way to evade them as they crossed over the center line to blast us with a shockwave that seemed to echo into our ears and hit us like a physical force. The echo reverberated sometimes for 10 seconds or more. This torture seemed to go on for hours, and I was sure that we had lost the side mirror more than once. We would have to pull over, but there was no place to pull over, no place to turn off, so we just endured what it seemed like lasts for hours, over and over again. But in reality, it was only about 40 minutes. I don't know how Hercules didn't crash. Finally, we came to the edge of the great plateau that looked down upon the Pacific coast and the city lights far below. Instead of heading to the coastal plain, we followed a road that turned left and towards the south and the Mexican-Guatemalan border. Late at night, we stopped at a truck stop to eat an overpriced meal that was the worst food of the entire journey. A pretty young woman and an equally pretty young boy worked the truck stop, servicing the lonely truckers as they made their way back and forth across the border. The young woman followed me into the restaurant and smiled at me and tossed her hair. I had been on the road now, it seemed like for weeks. It was only 3 days, and I was in the wild, wild west, where it all seemed all the rules were a thing of the past. There were no rules. The idea appealed to me because life on this road seemed very short, and my disappointment at passing the beautiful sirens had cost me no small amount. Hercules seemed not to care, so I finished my meal and went outside where she waited for me patiently. We slowly walked together back towards the truck, and then I saw the cop again that had been hanging around like some kind of uniformed seagull. He was about 20 years old at the most, a big kid, a third-grade dropout, who looked like he couldn't read or write and even had a hard time getting his brown uniform on correctly. He could barely dress himself. It was ill-fitting, and he looked like an oversized baby sporting an M1 U.S. Army surplus rifle. When I had seen him before, he was pacing around trying to figure out who to arrest and who he could extort enough money from to get through the week. Now he was following me and the girl back to the truck, which was amateurish by itself because all he had to do was wait until we were in flagrante, and then he could have easily walked up upon us unnoticed and extorted plenty of money from me in my embarrassment. I looked at the girl in a mute apology and gestured to Hercules that it was time to go. Now I was the one in a hurry. For the 4th time in my journey, a man who was heading south and had stopped to talk to Hercules walked up to me afterwards and said, "Be careful, that guy is crazy." The road to that border was not something you could really call a road. All the trucks were forced to go about 10 miles an hour or less to avoid the giant potholes, and the giant potholes were unavoidable. To keep the ruts from shaking you out of your seat, you had to go about 4 miles per hour. It felt like riding a jackhammer for 20 miles. I guess the constant traffic had destroyed the road, and no one had bothered to rebuild it. It was morning by the time we reached the border, and we paid a few bribes and made our way across in fairly short order. The Guatemalan side of the border was more strict. We were forced to park the trucks and wait around for several hours. The sun was very intense, and I was in for a hard lesson about the tropics. I didn't feel well, so I drank a couple of beers in a cantina and passed out for about an hour in a booth in the bar. The ugly American passed out in a bar, no doubt snoring loudly with my mouth open. Finally, we loaded back up and drove through the final checkpoint with the long line of cars. The border guard looked over our cargo and asked if we had anything to declare. Hercules seemed nervous and agitated again. Just one microwave and one gringo. One microwave and one gringo. The guard repeated. I bristled and let it piss me off. Maybe it's because I felt ill, and maybe it was because no sleep for 3 days, but I seemed to shake with anger. The guard didn't say anything, but he looked at me kindly as if to say, don't worry, and don't worry about it, friend, and I calmed down after a few deep breaths. We hit the open road finally, and we're making good time when 2 Guatemalan military officers in green uniforms, border guards actually, pulled us over to check our cargo against the documents we carried. They didn't ask for bribes and were very professional. It was obvious they were trying to interdict weapons smuggling and stolen goods. It only took 2 minutes, we were back on our way. We were chatting to pass the time, and Hercules volunteered that he used to work for the Guatemalan Defense Intelligence Agency. I guess I should have been more impressed. So what did you do for him? We intercepted communications from the Mexican military. They attacked us and took a lot of our land from our country. We have to watch them very carefully. We cannot trust them. I let it sink in that Hercules was a spook and what it meant in this part of the world. Isn't your country controlled by the military and intelligence services, I asked, trying to push his buttons and get a reaction. No more than your country is controlled by the CIA, he sneered. I took exception to the statement and said that we were a democracy and that his country was a dictatorship. We continued in this vein for a while till we both grew tired of arguing. The highway was punctuated by bridges every 3 or 4 miles. The bridges were generally about 50 yards long and traversed deep, narrow, deep ravines. Almost all of them had been blown up by the guerrillas and had been replaced by temporary spans that were put in place by the army that allowed only 1 car to pass at a time. Our turn came and the terror welled up in me from the pit of your stomach when you looked down into the void. I was reminded of the Royal Gorge Bridge when I was 8 years old. Wooden planks over a 1,000-foot drop on a sunny windy day. I recalled how the wood rattled under the car tires and thumped in the 2-inch spaces between the planks where you could see all the way to the bottom. After a couple more crossings into the void, the fear of falling subsided. The only bridges that had not been blown up were the ones at the homemade signs that claimed the bridges in the name of the guerrillas. Presumably, if the authorities had taken down these signs, the rebels came back at night and blew up the bridges. If they left the signs alone, the guerrillas let them keep the bridges without blowing them up. Nightfall was coming soon, and we wound up following an army truck as it stopped to drop off 2 soldiers at each end of the bridge to guard the bridge during the long, dark night. The soldiers didn't look too happy to be left to fend for themselves all alone in what was obviously someone else's bridge, the guerrillas. We stopped at a small town, and Hercules went on an errand he declined to describe, leaving me parked guarding the goods in the middle of the small business district. He entered a quasi-government building with an immense iron gate in the front and no signs of any kind. I realized to my horror that I needed to take a poop. No, I didn't need to take a poop. I was going to take a poop, whether I wanted to or not. There was no businesses open this early in the morning, no side alleys to use, not even any trees or bushes. I would have had better luck taking a crap unabsorbed in Times Square. God damn it. I saw what looked like a private home, and in panic, I knocked on the door and politely asked if a weary traveler could please use the restroom. Claro que sí, no problem, of course. I was kindly ushered into the cinder block home with a tin roof by the lady of the house. We entered the kitchen area as the family of 4 was eating breakfast. Great. I interrupted their morning meal. Introductions were made between myself and the family. The purpose of my visit was explained, and I was shown the bathroom. To my horror, the bathroom was in the kitchen. 10 feet from the kitchen table where they were still eating. And to make matters worse, there was no door, there was no ceiling. There were just cinder blocks around the toilet and a thin bed sheet for a door. My heart sank, but there was no choice save crapping in my pants or crapping on the curb in the next 20 seconds. Maybe I could make it to the curb. Muscle contractions almost doubled me over. No curbside service for you, fool. I hung my head and drew back the sheet. Defecated as quickly as possible, tried to flush. Nothing happened. As the entire room filled with the odor of gringo poop, I desperately tried to flush 3 more times and then gave up. I heard all the chairs at the kitchen table scooching in a hurry back as quickly as possible. Everyone left as fast as they could. And I waited for a moment, hoping they were all gone. Tried to flush 1 more time in despair, and then exited with my head down, looking at my shoes and mumbling my thanks. I made for the door in the safety of the truck. Damn it! Strange that the first Guatemalan family, kind strangers that I met, I managed to take a giant dump on their kitchen table during their breakfast. I think my actions pretty much encapsulated the entire 200-year history of U.S.-Guatemalan relations in about 5 minutes. The ugly American doesn't necessarily want to be the ugly American, but we don't always get to choose our roles in this play. No matter how hard I tried, I would always be the evil gringo on some level in their part of the world.